Will you keep in your mind this verse from Psalm 84? Blessed is the man whose strength is in thee, in whose heart are thy ways, who going through the vale of misery use it for a well, and the pools are filled with water. Besides what religion has to give to human beings of intellectual interpretations of life, it has two plain and practical problems which are always facing it. It has got to give men some power by which to get more mastery over themselves and their sins, and it's got to help them when they're in trouble to find peace and comfort. Religion is therefore both a strenuous and a soothing thing. Much of our difficulty has arisen from our being strenuous when we should have been comforting, and perhaps more often from our being soothing when we should have been drastic instead. We're to think now of religion in its power to tide us over the places of sorrow and trouble in our lives. I suppose who lives and thinks at all, who doesn't have to reckon with sorrow and trouble. We all have our early years of easy optimism when things are going well with us, the sky's full of sunlight. We ought to be glad for those years, for sometimes they're the years in which we form our great resolves and set out with magnificent hope toward great goals. But the time will come when something flings itself across our path which seems to chill our hope and put out the fires in our hearts. We set out upon a plan of work with that mixture of motives, selfish and altruistic, which is so nearly universal. We put our heart into it and work for all we're worth, but do what we will, the thing begins to drag. It doesn't seem to be altogether our fault, but a combination of forces, some of which we can't control. And one day, we must face it bravely but honestly, we have failed. Or a young man undertakes a large piece of work which is going to demand of him the maximum of intellectual and physical energy. One day begins to feel bad. A doctor tells him he must pull out of it all and go into a high atmosphere, where he finds a spot in his lung. And that man turns from what he had hoped to do and packs himself off to the country to try to regain his health. And the things he dreams there are full of fear and sadness. Or a family watches two beautiful children grow up amid every opportunity they can provide and gives them all the world's best and finds that they only expect more. One makes a good marriage which doesn't last very long because it's got no foundations of religion. The other one turns as hard as flint and has no human concern for anything but pleasure. These two children who began with so much promise, still in the eyes of the world appear so well, are disappointments to their parents, who carry in their hearts heavy misgivings, whether it wouldn't have been better if the kindness had been tempered with less of the selfish joy of giving to one's own, and more of the iron that makes for character. Or we see a family happy in its full circle, each contributing something to the whole life, and then one by one they fall sick and wither and drop away like the leaves off a tree until one alone is left to try to go on and make the best of it when the world no longer holds of much interest. No good to keep on with this list. We could picture 1,000 such instances. Every one of them would evoke the response of somebody who is listening in and who has been there. We live in a lonely and terrifying world. Men seem sometimes to be the playthings of a fortune which has in it neither reason to explain it nor rhyme to soften it. You haven't lived at all if you've come to the conclusion that all's well with the world. You've been sitting back in pudgy comfort where you don't see life as it is, what tragedies fasten upon human beings. I wish you could see what a minister sees in the course of a week if he's on his job. The reason we've got such shallow views about what Christ did for the world and make him a kind of a smiling cheermonger is that we don't reckon with the exceeding sinfulness of sin, the exceeding sorrowfulness of sorrow, and the very great force of evil itself. Now, I'm not giving much sentimentalizing about trouble. I generally try to say things which imply that most of man's difficulty is of his own making and can be of his own unmaking. I say those things because they are the zone of hope in human life, because I believe infinitely in man and his freedom to choose and carve out a wide destiny for himself if he will seek the will of God. But I've seen too much of life not to know that sadness and sorrow are not to be dismissed with any facile gesture of hard-hearted optimism, such as parades around us in these days in 100 self-deceived cults. Evil is serious business in all its aspects. Sorrow and trouble are one of them. You will not glorify God by minimizing the reality of trouble in the world. The New Testament does no such thing. In the world ye shall have tribulation. That is the verdict. Now what are we going to do about it? Everything depends upon how you take it, what you make of it. I'm not attempting any guesses now as to the question of why sorrow is here. I want to look into the practical question of what to do with it now we've got it. The solution is not a theoretical one, it's a practical one. Trouble crushes one life and softens another, embitters one, makes another sympathetic, because of the different ways it's taken. Let me make a few suggestions that have helped me when trouble was present. In the first place, see your own trouble in its setting as part of the long tragedy that's everywhere accompanied human life. You're not alone in it. I remember once going up on a hill beside the Bosphorus one afternoon in considerable distress of mind. And I began to think of the infinite pain that had been suffered in that region where I stood. I thought of Roman legions giving themselves that Constantine might build his capital. I thought of the workmen who toiled to build Santa Sophia, and of Justinian's vain cry when the church was completed, "I have conquered thee, O Solomon." Of the splendid folly of the Crusaders, crossing this strait into Asia Minor, never to return again to Europe. Gallipoli was a few hundred miles down the Narrows, and the bones of English lads filled a gigantic graveyard not far from the sea. Across the water lay Asia Minor, where Paul had labored and preached and worn himself out, more Mohammedan than Christian today. Possibly there were more Christians in Asia Minor at the end of St. Paul's life than there are now. And I began to realize that my own trouble was very small. Must be looked at in the light of all this pageant of pain down the ages. Sorrow, like sin, isolates its victims and makes them believe they're alone in their suffering. I think it a considerable help to make ourselves conscious of the conspicuous place which trouble and sorrow have been given in human experience. If you believe life is explainable at all, you must dignify the experience of trouble by granting that it has its place and carries some kind of meaning. And second, set your trouble in the light of the cross of Christ. The best the world ever saw came to this. He did not move serenely and indifferently across the stage of human affairs, scattering roses and smiling his way into men's protecting affections. The closer he got to meeting the world's need by showing the world where it stood in its relation to God, the closer did he come to treading upon the toes of men who wouldn't stand for it, and finally brought him to a criminal death. It would have been a mockery and a joke on us if he had come into the world in luxury, where men are in want, and slipped through the world in success, where men fail, and lived to enjoy the full fruit of his labors, where men are cut off in the bitterness of disappointment. If he be God, this had to happen. I should have no use for a God who wouldn't share this colossal tragedy by coming into it and bearing it. I should deny him a fraction of homage. But God did share it, shared the extreme of it, in ignominy and disappointment and physical pain. The simplest meaning of the cross is that God suffered. And in the end, that may be for us, while here below, the profoundest meaning. When you suffer, remember that God suffered and suffers still. And third, share your trouble. I don't mean share it for the relief it brings to you to talk about it, for that may be, after a while, a very selfish thing to do. I mean share it where it will create an atmosphere in which someone else in trouble can share that trouble with you so that they may find relief. There are gushing people, moist with piety and dripping with sentimentality, who find dissipation in unburdening their troubles on other people. Plainly, they must learn how to be unselfish with sorrow so that they don't force it on everybody, but also do not withhold it from those whom it will help. The sun alone can help free a ship caught in frozen ice fields, and you may keep a heart from breaking if you can start an ice floe. The sharing of trouble, which is for our own relief, is selfish and sentimental, but the sharing which builds a bridge across into the heart of another person is one of God's benedictions let into the world. Fourth, try to find a meaning in your trouble. Perhaps at the very beginning of trouble, you may be expected only to hold on tenaciously to old moorings and, as it were, to stand it. But as the time runs on and pain gives place to peace, you'll find that God hasn't left you at any time. He's been leading you through the darkness as well as through the day. You may find that a harshness has been melted out of you forever because of the sorrow you have suffered. You may find that your absurd trust in yourself, your pride in prosperity or pleasure in success, has given way to dependence upon God and reliance upon Him for all your needs. You may find that when someone you loved was withdrawn from you, for the first time you learned to love humanity. Now perhaps you see your child in every child, your brother in every man, your sister in every woman. I've seen women left alone in the world who became mothers and sisters to the world, men who became its fathers and brothers. There's always a hopeful way of taking trouble. A dear old saint of God said to me in her last illness and weakness, Now I have time to pray as long as I want for everybody I want to pray for. Think of that. You may discover that since you've been in trouble for the first time in your life, you can exercise genuine sympathy. It's easy to coin smooth words to say to people when they suffer, but no word at all is better if they know that you've been through with what they're going through. And this alone is to suffer with anybody. Now, I don't believe, my friends, that God sends trouble, or that God deliberately wills the trouble which comes upon the children of men. Much of it is of our own making. Some of it's due to natural forces in the physical universe to which we belong. Some of it I give up trying to understand. But I believe that God uses that trouble, turns it to good account, works it into the whole fabric of our lives, gives meaning to it. When I find a person, as occasionally one does, who still, after rebellious years have passed, still grudges the loss of her child or her husband, still reproaches God for a sorrow he didn't will, but is anxious to guide and use, I believe this person is nursing a sorrow for a kind of morbid joy which comes from clinging to it. You can't seek the meaning of a sorrow while you hug it to yourself, and you will not give it to God to shed his light upon it. You must let him make something of it, or you will have yourself been guilty of causing yourself injury, and cannot blame him if you turn sour and grow hard. You've done it because you refuse to find the meaning for yourself. You remember in Pilgrim's Progress where a Christian goes through the valley of humiliation. The story says, this valley of humiliation is of itself as fruitful a place as any the crow flies over, and I am persuaded if we could hit upon it, we might find somewhere hereabouts something that might give us an account of why a Christian was so hardly beset in this place. And thus, to read sorrow in the light of the sorrows of others and of our Lord himself, to allow sorrow to make us more sympathetic than we could possibly have been without it, to see what may give us an account of why we were so beset in this place, is to go through the veil of misery and use it for a well. The kind of faith which interprets experience in this fashion finds that the pools are filled with water, water enough for us to bear out and give to a thirsty world full of men who are like us in a desert. It looks back upon all the events of life and says that God has wondrously led, and that all things do work together for good to them that love him. It's no Christianity which tries to make good out of evil and says that sorrow doesn't exist. But neither is it Christianity which is overwhelmed and crushed by sorrow. It is Christianity which finds the hand of God in all experience. It was Jesus who said, in the world ye shall have tribulation. That is the simple, inescapable fact of every human being's experience. But he also said, be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. And that, too, is the inescapable experience of those who have sought to put their troubles and their lives in the hands of Christ and do not seek to interpret them until they have deeply prayed about them.